In the spring of 2461, the pharaoh instructed Mentuhotep to build a second smaller pyramid for his wife next to his own. Within weeks, a site was cleared and the second royal tomb begun. The queen's pyramid was constructed in the same way as its larger neighbor, but because of its size, only a single ramp was necessary. It was built perpendicular to the south face, while narrow banks of rubble and mud built around the other three sides made it easier for the workmen to move the casing stones into place. Besides checking the level of each course, the surveyors used plumb lines to make sure that the walls of both pyramids were rising at the correct angle. As progress continued uninterrupted year after year, Mentuhotep's great ability as an organizer as well as an architect became obvious. From the beginning, he had kept the quarries and work gangs far enough ahead of schedule to ensure that each block would be on the site when it was needed. By winter of the 10th year, the bases of both pyramids could easily be seen from fields several miles down the Nile. In the evenings, as the farmers patched their mud houses or added extra rooms, they boasted about their years of service to the pharaoh and about the number of stones their gang had brought during the flood. But they and their families knew that in 7 or 8 months they would leave again, and there was always the possibility that they might not return. Accidents were quite common as the heavy stones were moved, and each year the villages lost several of their men. In July of 2457, many of the work gangs were sent directly to the quarries at Tura, where stones cut in the preceding months were waiting to be transported to the site. These were the fine white casing stones for the pharaoh's pyramid. For the next 14 years, boats sailed back and forth, ferrying stone across the flooded valley. Thousands of blocks were dragged up the causeway, trimmed to size, and hauled up the ramps to their final destinations. When the pyramid reached a height of 400 feet, there was no longer enough wall space to support all 4 ramps, so 2 of them were abandoned. While a continuous procession of work gangs hauled their blocks up one of the remaining ramps, the other was used for bringing the empty sleds back down. As the pyramid grew higher, it also grew more quickly, and by October of 2442, 26 years after Mentuhotep first presented his plan, 124 courses had been completed. The flat area on top now measured only 10 feet square. On the 1st of November, a special ceremony was held to mark the arrival of the granite capstone. This large block, which was cut roughly in the shape of a small pyramid, would rest on the top course. After numerous prayers and offerings, it was dragged off the boat and up the causeway to the foot of one of the ramps. Following more prayers, laborers began the long climb to the summit, hauling the block behind them. Another group with ropes and levers traveled behind to prevent the sled from sliding backward when the haulers rested, and to help move the enormous weight around each corner of the pyramid. Once the sled was in place, the capstone was raised onto wooden blocking. The sled was then removed and the blocking carefully pulled out. A piece of stone that protruded from the base of the capstone slipped snugly into a hole cut in the center of the last course. This made the bond more permanent and guaranteed that the capstone was directly over the center of the pyramid. As the last piece of blocking was removed, the capstone sat firmly on its base and the actual building of the pyramid was finished. In gratitude, the priests standing on the ramps around the capstone burned incense and offered prayers to the gods. At the completion of the ceremonies, laborers began dismantling the remaining construction ramps. When they had removed about 30 feet of the rubble and mud, another gang erected wooden scaffolding to support work platforms around the exposed portion of the pyramid. From the highest platform, workmen using pieces of stone and abrasive powder ground the capstone into a smooth, shining peak. Below them, other workers chiseled away the steps of the casing, after which that area was also ground and polished. When the work on the upper portion of the casing was complete, 30 more feet of each ramp was removed and the scaffolding reconstructed at a lower level. This process was repeated until the entire surface of the pyramid was finished. Temenos wall, sanctuary, storage, plan of the mortuary temple, shrines, courtyard, entrance hall, causeway. By the time the capstone was in place, the stone for the temples and causeway had been delivered and cut to size. The mortuary temple was finished first. It contained an entry hall, a large open courtyard, 5 shrines, the sanctuary with its false door, and several storage rooms. A passage led from the courtyard to a 30-foot wide area around the base of the pyramid, which was enclosed by the high Temenos wall. When the first course of the temple had been laid, the enclosed area was filled with earth. The stones of the second course were dragged up a ramp outside the building across the fill and into place. More earth was then piled up to the top of the new blocks. When the core walls were complete, the earth, which now filled the entire temple, was dug out and the process repeated to construct the facing. When that fill was removed, roughly cut granite columns were erected to support the roof. Each shaft was hoisted into place by gangs of workmen pulling on ropes from the tops of the walls. Other men guided the columns from behind with levers. When all the columns were in place, the temple was again filled, and the roof slabs hauled up the ramp into position. When the roof was completed, the fill was removed layer by layer. It served as a platform from which skilled workers carved and then painted on the facing stone scenes of the pharaoh's journey into the next life. At the same time, others finished the capitals on top of the columns. The floor was finished last. It was paved with finely cut alabaster slabs. Top view, entrance to chapel, burial shaft, section. While the temples were under construction, mastabas or tombs were built along narrow streets laid out around the royal buildings. They were owned by the more important members of the pharaoh's court, and one of the largest belonged to Mummification. They were flat-roofed rectangular structures with sloping walls. The bodies were placed in a chamber at the bottom of a deep shaft cut in the rock below the mastaba. Each tomb contained a statue of the deceased to which the ka would occasionally return, and a chapel where offerings were made. The false door was located on the west wall of the chapel. When the mortuary temple was finished, oblong pits were cut into the rock along both sides. Boats specially constructed for the pharaoh's use in the next world were placed in 5 of the 6 pits. Each pit was then covered with several carefully fitted stone slabs whose seams were coated with plaster. Causeway, Great Hall, storage rooms, plan of the Valley Temple. The causeway was completed next. Like the mortuary temple, the walls were constructed first and then the roof slabs dragged across the fill and into place. The interior passage was 8 feet wide and 10 feet high and illuminated by slots cut in the roof. The walls were covered with painted relief carvings depicting some of the pharaoh's more impressive deeds, both real and imaginary. The Valley Temple was constructed in exactly the same way as the mortuary temple and was the last to be finished. It contained a large impressive hall and several small storage rooms. Several stone statues of the pharaoh carved in the royal workshop near the pyramid were positioned around the great hall. Laborers were still laying the alabaster floor slabs when, in the spring of 2439, the pharaoh died. His body was placed on the royal funerary barge in preparation for his last journey on earth. Thousands of people lined the river as the procession sailed by. Another boat carried relatives, including the queen and the pharaoh's son and successor. Others brought close friends and professional mourners. The high priests were waiting as the boats approached the Valley Temple. When the body had been removed, the royal barge was carefully dismantled and placed in the last of the pits. Preparing the pharaoh's body for burial was a complicated procedure, taking well over 2 months. Above all, the body had to be well preserved, and for this reason it was mummified. Each step of the process was accompanied by the appropriate religious ceremonies. The corpse was first taken to the embalmer's workshop located near the Valley Temple. It was laid out on a large table around which the priests could work. For the brain, having been dissolved with a special liquid, was removed through the nose with small hooks. Then the liver, lungs, stomach, and intestines were removed through a slit along the left side of the body. Each was embalmed and placed in a container called a canopic jar. The heart was left in place. After being dried in salt and washed, the body was anointed with ointments and covered with resins. The purified body was then wrapped in alternating layers of linen, sheets, and bandages. Religious ornaments made of gold and precious stones were placed between every few layers, and the body was covered with more resin. When the mummy was finished, it was taken to the large hall of the Valley Temple, where a ceremony called opening the mouth was performed. Although the mouth was not actually opened, the ceremony symbolically restored to the pharaoh his ability to eat, speak, and move, all of which were necessary in the next life. Several days later, the mummy was placed in a wooden coffin and taken up the causeway into the courtyard of the mortuary temple. Following more prayers and offerings, it was placed on an elaborate sled and dragged up a temporary ramp built between the north side of the pyramid and the temenus wall. From the entrance to the tunnel, the coffin was carried by the priests into the burial chamber. It was lowered into the sarcophagus, which was in turn covered by a heavy granite lid. The 4 canopic jars were then placed in a wooden box at the foot of the sarcophagus. The rest of the chamber and the storeroom were filled with those objects used by the king during his life, which were believed necessary in the afterlife. They included food, clothing, furniture, jewelry, weapons, and even games to occupy the slow moments of eternal life. After blessing the tomb and its occupant for the last time, the priests left the pyramid, lowering the portcullises behind them. Then several granite blocks were slipped one by one into the tunnel. Mummification himself supervised the final ceremony as the last casing stone was pushed into the remaining space to conceal the entrance forever. With the removal of the ramp, the pharaoh's eternal home was finished. His sacred body lay protected under a perfect man-made mountain of more than 2 million blocks of stone.